Most people think about income as a number. How much comes in each month, whether it's enough, whether it's growing. But income has a structure, not just an amount. And the structure of income, how many sources it comes from, how dependent it is on a single point, determines something more important than the number itself. It determines how vulnerable everything built on top of it actually is. A single income stream creates a specific kind of architecture. One source, one employer, one relationship between your continued presence and your financial foundation. That architecture has a name, a single point of failure. In any system, financial, mechanical, structural, a single point of failure means that one disruption doesn't just damage the system, it collapses it. Because there's no redundancy, no alternative path, no second structure holding things up when the first one breaks. And most people's financial lives are built entirely on that single point. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. The job disappears, the income disappears. Not reduced, not disrupted, gone. And everything built on top of that income, the housing, the car, the commitments, the lifestyle that expanded to meet what was coming in, all of it is now unsupported. Not in some distant hypothetical, in the immediate next month. That's the architecture of dependency, a foundation with no redundancy and no margin for disruption. And the uncomfortable reality is that most people are one event away from that foundation being removed. One layoff, one health crisis, one industry shift, one decision made by someone else in a meeting they weren't in. And none of those things are entirely within their control. This is where the conversation usually turns to emergency funds. Save 3 months of expenses, 6 months if you can. Build a buffer. And a buffer matters. It buys time. It absorbs a disruption without immediate collapse. But a buffer isn't a structure. It's a delay. It extends the runway before the single point of failure becomes a full collapse. It doesn't change the underlying architecture. The architecture is still one source, everything dependent on it, no alternative path producing if that source disappears. The buffer just means the collapse happens in month 4 instead of month 1. What actually changes the architecture is a second source. Not because of the income it adds, though that matters, but because of what a second source does to the structure underneath everything else. It means the first source is no longer the only thing holding up the foundation. It means a disruption to one doesn't collapse the system. It damages it. It creates pressure. But the foundation still exists. Something is still producing. The runway doesn't end when one source disappears. That's a structurally different position, not just financially, psychologically, behaviorally, because the decisions you make from a position with a second source are different from the decisions you make when one source is all there is. If this feels familiar, if you've felt this pressure but never had words for it, this channel isn't here to motivate you. It's here to help you see clearly. If that resonates, like the video, subscribe. More clarity is coming. The financial cost of single-source dependency is obvious. If the source disappears, the income disappears. But there's a cost that operates long before any disruption occurs, a cost that runs continuously, quietly, while the source is still intact and everything looks stable. It's the cost of leverage. Leverage in a negotiation comes from optionality, the ability to walk away, the ability to say no, the ability to hold a position because the alternative to this isn't collapse. When one income stream is the entire financial foundation, the ability to walk away is effectively removed. You can't afford the gap. You can't absorb the transition period. You can't say no to the offer that's below what you wanted because something is better than nothing when nothing means the foundation goes. And the employer knows this, not always consciously, but structurally. The system is designed to know this. A workforce of single-source dependence is a workforce with limited leverage. They show up, they accept, they stay. Not because they want to, because the architecture of their financial life doesn't give them the structural freedom to do otherwise. This plays out in ways most people feel but never name. The raise that wasn't pushed for because losing the job felt too risky. The working conditions accepted because the income was needed and there was no backup. The career path stayed on long past when it stopped making sense, because switching required a gap period the financial structure couldn't absorb. These aren't failures of courage. These are rational responses to a structural position that has removed the ability to risk. Single-source dependency doesn't just cost money when the source disappears. It costs leverage every single day it's the only source. There's a second cost that operates at the same time: options compression. When the financial foundation is entirely dependent on one source, every major decision gets filtered through that dependency. Can I afford to take this risk? Can I afford to make this change? Can I afford to invest this time in something that won't pay off immediately? The answer, structurally, is often no. Not because the opportunity isn't real, but because the architecture can't absorb the uncertainty that pursuing it would require. And so, options get compressed. Decisions get conservative. The range of what feels possible shrinks to fit what the single source can support. Year after year, decision after decision, all of them shaped by the dependency underneath them. None of this is visible from inside a stable single source. When the job is secure, when the income is arriving, the dependency doesn't feel like a constraint. It feels like stability. And stability feels like something to protect, not something to question. But the stability is conditional. It exists only as long as one relationship between you and one employer remains intact. And that relationship is not entirely within your control. The stability is real. The dependency underneath it is also real. And the cost of that dependency, in leverage, in options, in decisions never made, runs continuously, whether the disruption ever comes or not. The shift away from single-source dependency doesn't start with a dramatic move. It doesn't start with quitting. It doesn't start with a side hustle that consumes every spare hour. It doesn't start with a business plan or a significant investment or a threshold you haven't reached yet. It starts with a structural question. What is the second source? Not what could it eventually be, not what would be ideal. What is actually available now, at the current position, with the current resources, with the current time, that could begin producing something independent of the primary source? The answer looks different for different people. For some, it's a skill that can be applied outside the employment context: consulting, freelance, contract work. Something that uses existing capability in a structure that isn't dependent on a single employer relationship. For others, it's a small capital position, something deployed into an asset that produces a return independent of presence. Small at first, but structured correctly. For others, it's a system, something built once that continues to produce without requiring the same input every time. The form matters less than the principle. A second source exists. It produces something. And if the primary source disappears, the foundation doesn't collapse entirely. This is not about replacing the primary income. Not initially. Not for most people in the early stages. It's about changing the architecture, moving from a single point of failure to a structure with at least partial redundancy. Even a second source that produces a fraction of what the primary produces changes the negotiating position, changes the decision-making range, changes what options feel available because the cost of disruption is no longer total collapse. That's a structural shift, even if the numbers don't look dramatic. The process is slow. Building a second source while maintaining the first requires time, attention, and energy that the primary source is already consuming. There's no clean version of this, no frictionless path. It gets built in the margin, in the discretionary hours, with the surplus that's protected from the consumption cycle. Slowly, inconsistently at first, then with more consistency as the structure develops. And at some point, the second source becomes real enough that a third becomes thinkable. And the architecture shifts again. Each additional source reducing the weight that any single one carries, each one making the foundation slightly less vulnerable to a single disruption. The goal isn't a specific number of streams. The goal is a structure where no single source holds the entire weight, where a disruption to one is a problem, not a collapse, where the financial foundation doesn't depend entirely on one relationship that isn't fully within your control. That's what the second source is actually building toward, not more income. A different architecture, one that can absorb disruption, one that returns leverage to the person standing on top of it, one that expands the range of decisions that feel possible. Most people never build it because the primary source feels stable enough that the architecture never gets questioned. Until it does. And by then, the time that could have built the second layer has already been spent inside the first one. If this shifted something for you, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something. When most people think about income, they think about one thing: the paycheck. How much it is, whether it's growing, whether it's enough. And that framing, income as a single category measured only by amount, obscures something structurally important. Income isn't one thing. It's a category with fundamentally different types inside it, each with a different relationship to time, effort, presence, and compounding. And the type of income being built matters more than the amount in almost every case. Think about what varies between income types. The first variable is presence. Some income requires you to be there, actively, hourly. Your output directly tied to the time you put in. Other income doesn't. It produces whether you're present or not, whether you're working or not, whether you're awake or not. That distinction between presence-dependent and presence-independent income is one of the most structurally significant differences in finance, and most people have only ever built the first kind. The second variable is scalability. Some income scales with input: more hours, more income, better performance, higher rate. But the ceiling is always determined by how much input can be sustained. Other income scales with position. The asset grows, the system expands, the return increases without a proportional increase in input. One type scales linearly, the other compounds. And those are not equivalent trajectories over time. The third variable is leverage. Some income creates leverage, the ability to produce more from a position than from effort alone. A business that employs people, a portfolio that compounds, an asset that generates rent, a system that produces without your direct involvement. Each of these multiplies output beyond what one person's effort could create. Other income has no leverage. One person, one set of hours, one output, capped by the limits of that person's time. The income with leverage and the income without it are structurally different instruments. Even if the amounts look similar today, they compound toward very different positions over time. Most people never examine which type of income they're building, not because they don't care, because the system around them presented one type as the default and never made the others feel like accessible alternatives. Earned income, the paycheck, the salary, the hourly wage, is what school prepares you for, what the labor market is structured around, what culture frames as the normal way income works. The other types exist. They're visible, they're discussed, but they're framed as advanced, as requiring capital or connections or a threshold most people haven't reached yet. When, in reality, the structural differences between income types are just mechanics. And mechanics can be understood before they're accessed. Understanding them clearly is the beginning of building something different from the default. Earned income is the most familiar type. You perform work, you receive compensation. The exchange is direct and proportional. More hours, more pay. Better skills, higher rate. More value delivered, more earned. It's intuitive. It's how most people understand income to work. And for most of history, it's been the primary mechanism through which ordinary people built financial lives. But earned income has a ceiling, and that ceiling is structural, not a function of effort. The ceiling exists because of one fixed constraint: time. There are a limited number of hours in a day, a week, a year, and earned income, in its purest form, is a direct exchange of those hours for compensation. Which means the ceiling on earned income is determined by two things: how many hours can be sold and the rate per hour. You can increase the rate, skill development, specialization, promotion, career progression. You can increase the hours, to a point. But hours have a physical limit, and beyond a certain threshold, more hours produce diminishing returns on everything outside the income. So the ceiling exists, and it's not breakable through effort alone, because effort is constrained by time, and time is finite. There's a second structural property of earned income that's less discussed. It's fully presence-dependent. The income arrives because you showed up, because you performed, because the hours were exchanged. The moment the exchange stops, the income stops. There is no residual, no compounding, no position that continues to produce after the effort ends. The relationship between input and output resets to zero every time the work stops. This means earned income produces no accumulation in itself. What accumulates is what's left over after the income has been spent, the surplus deployed elsewhere. But the income itself doesn't compound, doesn't grow while you sleep, doesn't build a position independent of the next day's effort. None of this makes earned income worthless. It's the foundation most people start from, the mechanism that generates the surplus that can eventually be deployed elsewhere. The problem isn't earned income itself. It's treating earned income as both the foundation and the destination, using it as the only structure, building an entire financial life on top of it without ever developing anything that produces differently. Because an entire financial life built on presence-dependent, time-capped income is an entire financial life that stops producing the moment the presence stops. The ceiling on earned income isn't a personal limitation. It's a structural property of the income type. And understanding that distinction matters, because most people who feel stuck at a financial ceiling respond by trying to push through it with more effort, more hours, better performance, higher productivity, all of which are reasonable within the structure of earned income, all of which will produce incremental gains within that structure, but none of which will break through the ceiling, because the ceiling isn't made of effort, it's made of time. And effort can't manufacture more time. It can only use the existing time more efficiently, until the efficiency runs out. Pause for a second. If you're still listening, it's probably because this didn't feel exaggerated. That's intentional. If this way of thinking matters to you, like the video, subscribe. We'll keep going deeper. Beyond earned income, there are income types that share one structural property earned income never has. They produce without your direct presence. Not because you're not involved, not because no work went into building them, but because once the position exists, once the asset is deployed, the system is built, the structure is in place, it continues to produce independent of your hourly input. Passive income is the most commonly discussed. Rental income, royalties, licensing fees, revenue from content or systems built once and accessed repeatedly. The defining characteristic isn't that it requires no work. Building the position requires significant work. The defining characteristic is that the ongoing production is decoupled from ongoing hourly input. The property generates rent whether you're working that day or not. The royalty arrives whether you're thinking about it or not. The system produces without requiring the same effort each time it delivers output. That decoupling between production and presence is what makes it structurally different. Portfolio income operates similarly. Dividends, interest, capital gains from positions held. The income arrives from the position, not from the effort. You don't clock in to receive a dividend. You hold the position. The position produces. The production compounds back into the position. The position grows. The production grows. That's the compounding property that earned income doesn't have. Earned income adds. Portfolio income multiplies. And over a long enough time horizon, the difference between adding and multiplying produces outcomes that feel completely disproportionate to the original inputs. Business income, at its most structural, operates on leverage. A business that employs people produces output beyond what any single person's effort could create. The owner's income isn't capped by the owner's hours. It's connected to the output of a system that can grow, that can employ more people, that can serve more customers, that can generate more revenue without a proportional increase in the owner's direct input. That's leverage in its most direct form. Not borrowed money, not risk for its own sake. The structural ability of a position to produce beyond what individual effort allows. What all of these share, passive, portfolio, business income, is a separation between the time spent building the position and the ongoing production that position generates. You build once, the position produces repeatedly. With earned income, you produce once per hour exchanged. The production stops when the hours stop. With presence-independent income, The production continues after the building phase is complete. It compounds, it accumulates, it builds a position that gets stronger over time rather than resetting to zero each time the work stops. That's the structural difference that matters most, not the specific form it takes, not the specific asset class or vehicle. Whether the income continues when you're not there. And for most people, all of their income stops the moment they do. There's a comparison most people make when thinking about income. They compare amounts. A salary of this much versus that much. A side income of this size versus that size. Total income this year versus last year. And amount matters. It's not irrelevant. But there's a more important comparison that almost never gets made. Type. Consider two positions. Person A earns a high salary, comfortable, well above average, growing steadily year over year. Person B earns significantly less from their job, but has built a small portfolio income and one small passive income stream alongside it. By income amount, Person A is ahead, clearly. By income type, the positions are not equivalent. Person A's income stops entirely if the employment ends. Every dollar is presence dependent. The ceiling is time. The trajectory is linear. Person B's income has redundancy. Part of it continues regardless of what happens to the job. Part of it compounds without additional input. The trajectory is not purely linear. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, those two structural positions produce very different outcomes. This is why type matters more than amount. A larger amount of the wrong income type doesn't change the structural position. It makes the ceiling more comfortable. It makes the dependency feel more secure. It makes the single point of failure feel less like a vulnerability. But the architecture is unchanged. One source, presence-dependent, linear ceiling, stops when the effort stops. And the comfort that comes with a higher amount is precisely what makes the architecture harder to question. Because everything feels fine. The income is solid, the lifestyle is supported, the future looks manageable. Until the source disrupts, or the ceiling appears, or the realization arrives that decades of high-earned income didn't build a position that produces independently. The shift toward income type doesn't require abandoning earned income. It requires adding alongside it, deliberately, with an understanding of what's being built and why the type matters. Even a small position in a presence-independent income type deployed consistently over time begins to change the structural picture. Not dramatically at first. The amounts are small. The compounding is invisible. But the type is different, and different types compound differently. The earned income adds. The passive position compounds. The portfolio builds on itself. And over time, the compounding position built from smaller amounts can exceed the linear position built from larger ones. Most people spend their entire financial lives optimizing one income type, getting better at earning, negotiating higher rates, climbing toward a ceiling they don't realize is structural until they're standing underneath it. The ceiling isn't personal. The ceiling isn't a reflection of their effort. It's just what earned income does. It caps. And the only way past it isn't more effort inside the same type. It's building a different type alongside it. Slowly, structurally, with the understanding that the type determines the trajectory. And trajectory is what actually changes the position over time. If this shifted something for you, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something. The first secondary stream is the hardest one to build. Most people know this going in. The early stage is fragile. The returns are small. The effort per dollar is high. The compounding is invisible. What most people don't anticipate is what happens after. After the first stream stabilizes, after it begins to produce consistently, after the early stage is through and the thing actually holds. What happens next is not what the plan assumed. What happens is comfort. The first stream succeeds. Not dramatically, not at a scale that changes everything overnight, but it produces. It's real. It exists outside the primary income. It represents something built, something that wasn't there before. And that feeling, the feeling of having built something, is significant enough to become its own anchor. The first stream becomes the proof that building is possible, the evidence that the system works, the thing pointed to when the question is asked, "What have I built outside my job?" And that proof, that evidence, that thing, becomes something to protect. Not to build from, to protect, which is the beginning of the first stream becoming the last stream. The comfort zone of the first stream has a specific structure. The stream is now familiar. The work required to maintain it is known. The returns are predictable. The risk feels managed. Starting a second stream means leaving that familiarity, returning to the early stage, accepting small returns again, high effort per dollar again, invisible compounding again. After having moved past all of that with the first stream, returning to it feels like regression, not progress, not the next step in a sequence, a step backward. And so, the second stream keeps being deferred, until the first stream is larger, until the conditions are better, until something shifts that makes starting again feel less like going back to zero. That shift rarely comes on its own, because the first stream is a self-reinforcing comfort zone. The more time spent inside it, the more familiar it becomes. The more familiar it becomes, the more starting something new feels like a disruption rather than a progression. And the gap between where the first stream is and where the second stream would start feels larger with each passing month, not smaller. Not because the starting point of the second stream has actually moved, because the comfort level inside the first has increased. And comfort doesn't produce movement. It produces maintenance. This is why most people who successfully build a first secondary stream never build a second. Not because they failed, not because the system didn't work, because the first stream succeeded just enough to become a new version of the same dependency. A better dependency, a more diversified one that produces something outside the primary source, but still a comfort zone, still a ceiling, still a position that feels secure enough to make the next move feel unnecessary. Until it isn't. Until the first stream disrupts, or the primary income disrupts, or the realization arrives that two sources were always the plan, not the destination. Before this continues, if you felt seen instead of sold to, that's the entire point of Relentless Wealth. Like the video, subscribe. We're just getting started. The transition from one income stream to multiple isn't primarily about finding the next idea. Ideas are rarely the constraint. Most people who have successfully built one secondary stream can identify several things they could potentially build next. The constraint isn't imagination, it's recognition. Specifically, recognizing when the first stream has stabilized enough to actually free capacity for the next. Stabilization has a specific meaning here. It doesn't mean the first stream is producing at its full potential. It doesn't mean it requires no attention. It doesn't mean it has reached whatever scale was originally imagined. It means the first stream is no longer in the early stage. It's no longer fragile, no longer dependent on concentrated input to avoid collapsing, no longer requiring the same intensity it needed to get through the beginning. It runs with maintenance input rather than development input. And that distinction between development input and maintenance input is where the capacity for the next stream actually comes from. Development input is intensive. The early stage of any income stream requires focused, sustained effort over a concentrated period. Building the structure, establishing the system, getting through the fragile phase where it could stall or collapse if the input drops. Maintenance input is different. Once the structure exists, once the system runs, the input required to keep it producing is substantially less than what was required to build it. And that freed input, that difference between what the first stream needed to develop and what it now needs to maintain, is the capacity available for the second stream. Not time created from nothing, not energy manufactured. Capacity freed by the first stream moving from development to maintenance. The transition requires one more thing beyond recognizing stabilization. It requires resisting the instinct to reinvest the freed capacity back into the first stream. Because the first stream is familiar. Because more input into the first stream produces visible results in a known system. Because improving what already exists feels safer than starting something new. And so the freed capacity often gets absorbed by the first stream instead of directed toward the second. The first stream gets better, more developed, more optimized. But the second stream never starts, and the architecture stays at one secondary source instead of moving toward two. The transition requires a deliberate decision, not a feeling, not a moment of readiness, not a sign that conditions are right. A deliberate decision that the first stream has stabilized, that its maintenance input is less than its development input was, and that the difference will go toward the second stream. Starting now. Not when the first stream is larger, not when conditions improve, not when the second idea feels more certain. When the first stream holds. That's the transition point. And the people who move past the first secondary stream are almost always the ones who make that decision deliberately, rather than waiting for the moment to feel right on its own. The plan going in almost never matches what actually develops. Most people who set out to build multiple income streams have a sequence in mind, a logical progression, a clear order, a set of positions that make sense together, that feel like they'll build neatly toward a coherent structure. And then, reality engages with the plan. The first stream develops differently than expected, slower in some ways, faster in others, in a direction slightly different from where it was pointed. And the plan starts to bend. This is structurally normal. Compounding income structures don't develop linearly. They develop through feedback, through the actual experience of building. What works, what doesn't, what produces more than expected, what produces less, and the adjustments that experience forces. The plan provides direction. The feedback provides correction. And the correction usually points somewhere different from where the plan assumed. Not wrong, different. And the people who compound successfully are the ones who follow the correction rather than the original plan when the two diverge. What this means in practice is that the second stream rarely turns out to be what was planned when the first stream started. The first stream reveals something about where leverage actually exists in the current position, about what skills produce more value than expected, about what markets respond to what the first stream was building. And the second stream often grows from that revealed information, not from the original plan. Which means the architecture of multiple streams tends to be more coherent than it appeared going in, but less coherent to the original vision, less planned, more compounded, more responsive to what the building process actually revealed. There's a longer pattern worth naming. Over a 10-year horizon, the income structure that develops almost never looks like what was imagined at the start. Not because the vision was wrong, because compounding doesn't follow visions. It follows feedback. It follows what works. It follows what the market or the asset or the system actually responds to. And the structure that emerges from that process is usually more specific, more leveraged, more aligned with actual capability and position than anything that could have been planned before the building began. This is why the roadmap framing for income diversification consistently misleads people. A roadmap implies a known path, a fixed sequence, a plan that holds from start to finish. But compounding income structures don't follow fixed paths. They follow feedback loops. They develop through building, learning, adjusting, and building again from a slightly different position. The people who compound successfully don't follow the plan rigidly. They start with a direction. They build the first stream. They follow what the first stream reveals. They start the second stream from the corrected position. And they keep following the feedback, adjusting the structure as it develops until what exists is something the original plan never could have specified, but something that compounds in exactly the direction it needed to. If this shifted something for you, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something. Most people who decide to build an income portfolio think about year one the wrong way. They think about diversification, how many streams to add, what the mix should look like, how to spread across different income types as quickly as possible. And that thinking, applied in year one, almost always produces a weaker portfolio than the alternative. Because year one isn't about diversification, it's about depth. Depth means one thing built well, one secondary position developed past the early stage, past the fragile phase, past the point where it could collapse if the input drops for a month, into something that holds, that produces consistently, that runs on maintenance input rather than development input. That's the year one objective. Not multiple streams started, not a diversified mix established, not a portfolio that looks impressive when described to someone else. One position that actually holds. The reason depth matters more than breadth in year one comes back to the threshold property of attention. Early-stage income streams require more concentrated input than established ones. Dividing that input across multiple streams in year one means none of them receive what they need to get through the early stage. They stay fragile. They stay dependent. They stall. And at the end of year one, instead of one solid position, there are multiple half-developed ones, each requiring input to survive, none producing enough to justify the effort. That's a weaker foundation than one position that holds, because one position that holds can fund the next, can free the capacity for the next, can provide the stability from which the second is built correctly. Depth in year one also means choosing the right first position, not the most exciting one, not the one that sounds most impressive, Not the one with the highest potential ceiling if everything goes perfectly. The one most aligned with existing capability and resources. The one requiring the least disruption to the primary income. The one that can be built within current discretionary time without compressing what the primary source needs. The one most likely to get through the early stage and reach stability within a year. Because a boring first position that holds is structurally more valuable than an ambitious first position that stalls. The boring one provides the foundation. The ambitious one provides the story, but not the structure. Year 1 done right looks like less than most people plan for. One stream, slow development, small returns, invisible compounding. It doesn't look like a portfolio. It looks like a beginning. But a real beginning. One position actually developed past the fragile early stage is structurally more valuable than 3 positions that never got there. Because the real beginning compounds. The 3 unfinished positions just consume time and produce the illusion of progress without the structural reality of it. Year 1 is depth. Everything else gets built on top of that. Pause for a second. If you're still listening, it's probably because this didn't feel exaggerated. That's intentional. If this way of thinking matters to you, like the video, subscribe. We'll keep going deeper. Year 2 and 3 are where most people make the second major mistake. After year 1, after the first position holds, the instinct is to add quickly, to make up for the time spent developing only one stream, to build the portfolio that year 1 was supposed to start. And that instinct, applied without examining what year 1 actually produced, leads to the same fragmentation that year 1 avoided. The middle stage requires reading the first position accurately, not just whether it holds, what it reveals. Every income stream, once developed past the early stage, reveals information that wasn't available before building it. Where the leverage actually exists in the current position. What skills produce more value than expected? What the market responds to? What the structure does naturally versus what it requires effort to sustain. That information is the raw material for the second position, not the original plan, not the next item on a predetermined list. What the first stream revealed about where the next build is most likely to develop quickly and compound effectively. The income mix that builds structural wealth over time is not a predetermined combination. It's not a specific ratio of passive to active income, not a target number of streams across different categories, not a template that works for everyone in the same sequence. It's the combination that emerges from building one position, reading what it reveals, and building the next position from that corrected understanding. Which means the mix looks different for different people, because different positions reveal different leverage points. Someone whose first stream was built from an existing skill might find the second stream is most naturally a capital position, something that compounds independent of continued personal effort. Someone whose first stream was a capital position might find the second stream is most naturally a system, something that amplifies what the capital position produces. The sequence is emergent, not predetermined. What the middle stage requires is patience with that emergence. The pressure in year 2 and 3 is to add streams faster, to show more diversification, to build a portfolio that looks more developed from the outside. But the structural question isn't how many streams exist. It's how many of them are actually past the early stage and producing independently. A portfolio with 3 streams, 1 stable, 2 fragile, is structurally weaker than a portfolio with two streams, both stable. The number doesn't compound. The stability compounds. And the middle stage is where that distinction either gets honored or gets sacrificed for the appearance of progress. Year 2 and 3 done right still looks slow from the outside. One stream stabilized in year 1, a second stream developing through year 2, maybe stabilizing by year 3, a third stream beginning if the second has genuinely freed capacity. Not 5 streams, not a diversified portfolio that covers every income category. 2 or 3 positions, each one real, each one past the fragile stage, each one producing something that doesn't require daily active presence to sustain. That's what the middle stage actually builds toward. Not the most streams possible, the most stable streams possible. Stable compounds. The rest is just activity. At the end of 3 years, if the process played out structurally, the income portfolio that exists almost certainly doesn't look like what was planned at the start. The streams are different, the mix is different, the sequence wasn't what was intended. The timeline moved differently than the original estimate. And most people, looking at that gap between what was planned and what actually developed, feel like something went wrong. It didn't. The 3-year picture looks the way it does because compounding is responsive, not prescriptive. It responds to what works. It responds to what the market accepts. It responds to where leverage actually exists rather than where it was assumed to be. And a portfolio built through that process, through building, reading, adjusting, building again, is more aligned with actual position and capability than any plan developed before the building started. More specific, more leveraged, more likely to compound forward because it grew from real feedback rather than theoretical structure. What the 3-year picture typically does look like, if the process was followed correctly, is this: a primary income that's been protected, performing well, generating consistent surplus. One income stream that's been stable for at least a year, producing consistently, running on maintenance input, compounding slowly. A second stream past the early stage, producing something, not yet fully stable, still requiring some development input, but real. Possibly a third stream just beginning, if the second has freed enough capacity. Still fragile, still early, but started correctly, from the freed capacity of the second rather than from urgency. That doesn't look like a portfolio most people would describe as financially free. It doesn't produce the kind of income that makes the primary source optional. Not yet. But it's structurally sound. Each position is real, each one past or moving past the early stage, each one compounding in a direction that's been validated by actual building, not assumed from a plan. And a structurally sound portfolio at 3 years compounds into something significantly different at 5 years, at 7, at 10. The 3-year picture isn't the destination. It's the proof that the structure is working. Most people get the 3-year picture wrong because they measure it against the original plan, rather than against the structural question that actually matters. Not, does this look like what I imagined? But, is each position real? Is each one past the fragile stage? Is each one compounding? Is the primary income protected? Is there surplus being generated and deployed into the next position? If the answers are yes, the portfolio is developing correctly, regardless of whether it matches the vision, regardless of how many streams exist, regardless of whether the timeline looks like what was originally planned. Structure compounds. Plans don't. And a structurally sound 3-year portfolio, however different from the original vision, is the foundation that everything after gets built on top of. If this shifted something for you, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something. Most people who stay inside a single income stream don't do so because they decided to. They do so because they delayed. And the delay had a structure, not laziness, not a lack of ambition, not an absence of awareness that a second income would be valuable. A specific set of conditions that made starting feel premature. Conditions that kept renewing themselves, year after year, until the window that felt like the right time to start never quite opened. The first condition is the threshold illusion, the belief that starting requires reaching a certain level first. Enough savings, enough time, enough stability in the primary income, enough knowledge about what to build, enough confidence that the thing being built will actually work. And these requirements don't feel unreasonable. They feel prudent, like responsible preparation before making a move. But the threshold keeps shifting. The savings get allocated elsewhere. The time stays compressed. The stability feels perpetually provisional. The knowledge never feels complete enough. The confidence waits for certainty that never arrives. And so the start keeps being deferred to a future moment that has everything the current moment lacks. A moment that never comes. The second condition is the comparison problem. Most people's first exposure to what a second income looks like comes from the extreme end. The business generating significant revenue, the real estate portfolio producing passive income, the investment account large enough to live off the returns. These are real, they exist, but they represent the mature, developed version of something that started much smaller. And comparing the starting point to the mature version produces a gap that feels insurmountable. Not because it is, but because the intermediate stages, the early, messy, small-producing stages, are invisible in the narrative. Nobody documents the beginning when it looks like nothing. They document the outcome when it looks like success. So the perception of what starting requires is calibrated to the wrong reference point, and starting feels like it requires access to something that isn't currently available. The third condition is the cost of waiting. Waiting feels neutral, like maintaining the current position until the conditions improve. But waiting has a cost. Every month of delay is a month of compounding that doesn't happen. A position started small today and held consistently for 5 years produces a different outcome than the same position started 2 years from now. Not because the position is dramatically different, because the time is. And time is the engine of compounding. Waiting doesn't preserve optionality. It consumes it. Each month that passes without a position being started is a month of compounding that can never be recovered. The delay mechanism isn't irrational. It's a reasonable response to how the starting point has been framed. Too large, too complex, too dependent on resources not yet available. But the framing is wrong, and the cost of the delay, in time, in compounding, in positions that could have been building while everything else stayed the same, is the most expensive part of never starting. More expensive than a bad start, more expensive than a slow start, more expensive than starting small and building gradually towards something that compounds. Because a bad start can be corrected, a slow start can be accelerated, but the time lost to waiting doesn't come back. If this feels familiar, if you've felt this pressure but never had words for it, this channel isn't here to motivate you. It's here to help you see clearly. If that resonates, like the video. Subscribe. More clarity is coming. The barrier to starting a second income is almost never what it appears to be. It appears to be capital, resources, time, a specific skill or asset not yet possessed. But the actual barrier, in most cases, is the perception of the threshold. The gap between what starting is imagined to require and what it actually requires. And that gap is almost always significantly larger in the imagination than in reality. What does starting actually require? At the most fundamental level, it requires one thing: a deployable unit of something. That something can be capital, a small amount deployed into a position that begins to produce a return. It can be a skill, an existing capability that can be structured outside the employment context, applied independently, traded directly without the intermediary of an employer. It can be time, discretionary hours directed toward building something that has the structural properties of a system, something that produces without requiring the same input every time. In every case, the deployable unit is smaller than the threshold illusion suggests. The capital threshold is the most misunderstood. Most people believe that meaningful capital deployment requires a significant amount, enough to generate returns that feel worth the effort of managing, enough to justify calling it investing rather than just saving, enough to produce an outcome that looks like the examples they've seen. But the purpose of the first position isn't to produce a significant return immediately. It's to start the compounding clock. A small amount, deployed consistently, even a fraction of what feels significant, begins compounding from the moment it's deployed. The return is small. The position is small. The impact on the monthly financial picture is minimal. But the clock has started. And the clock is the asset. The skill threshold works similarly. Most people underestimate the market value of what they already know. The skills built inside employment, the expertise developed over years of doing a specific thing well, have value outside the employment context. Consulting, freelance work, contract engagements, knowledge-based services applied directly to people who need what you know. The skill already exists. The market for it exists. The only thing that doesn't exist yet is the structure that connects your capability to that market outside the employer relationship. Building that structure is the work of starting, not acquiring a new skill, not reaching a new level of expertise. Structuring what already exists in a different way. The time threshold is the most honest barrier. Time is genuinely constrained. The labor system consumes most of it. What remains is discretionary, and discretionary time has competing demands. But the amount of time required to start a second income is smaller than the amount required to develop one fully. Starting doesn't require a significant reallocation of time. It requires a consistent small allocation, protected deliberately, directed at something specific. 2 hours a week, applied consistently, over months and years, produces something. Not immediately, not dramatically, but structurally. And structurally is the only way anything that compounds gets built. The threshold was always lower than the delay suggested. The starting point was always closer than it looked. The first stage of income diversification doesn't look like financial independence. It doesn't look like a business. It doesn't look like a portfolio. It doesn't look like anything that matches the finished version of what it's eventually building toward. It looks small. It produces little. It requires more effort per dollar than the primary income, and it exists alongside everything else, not instead of it. That's what the first stage actually looks like. And most people never start because the first stage doesn't match the image of the destination. The first stage has one structural requirement. It must be separate from the primary source. Not a promotion, not a raise, not a performance bonus from the same employer. Something that produces from a different structure entirely. Because the purpose of the first stage isn't the income it generates immediately. It's the architectural shift it represents. Moving from one source to more than one source. From full dependency on a single point to partial redundancy. Even if the second source is producing a fraction of what the first one produces, the architecture is different. And a different architecture compounds differently over time. The first stage also has one behavioral requirement: consistency over intensity. The instinct when starting something new is to apply significant energy in a short burst, to treat the early stage with the same urgency that a deadline or a crisis produces. That approach works for some things. It doesn't work for building income structures, because income structures compound, and compounding is a function of time, not of intensity applied in one period. A small, consistent input, sustained over years, produces more than a large, inconsistent input applied in bursts. Because the consistent input stays in the position, keeps compounding, keeps building the structure through the periods when motivation is low and the early results feel insignificant. The inconsistent input produces results during the burst, then stops, and compounding stops with it. The size of the start matters less than the structure of it. A small position in the right structure, deployed consistently, held through the early stage when returns feel invisible, builds differently than a larger position in the wrong structure, abandoned when the early results disappoint. This is why the first stage is less about finding the right vehicle and more about establishing the pattern. The pattern of starting, the pattern of consistency, the pattern of building something outside the primary source and maintaining it even when it produces almost nothing at the beginning. Because the beginning is always the smallest part. Compounding makes the beginning look insignificant in retrospect, but the beginning is where the clock starts. Most people never get to see what their second income could have built because they never started it. Not because they weren't capable, not because the resources weren't available in some form. Because the first stage looked too small to be worth starting, and they waited for a stage that felt more significant, while the compounding clock that could have been running stayed stopped. The first stage is always small. That's not a reason to wait. That's just what every large position looked like at the beginning. If this shifted something for you, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something. When most people decide to build a second income, the instinct is to start multiple things: a side project, an investment account, a freelance offering, something else that looked interesting last week. All of them started around the same time, all of them receiving some attention, none of them receiving enough. And after 6 months, none of them have developed into anything that produces meaningfully. Not because the ideas were wrong, not because the person wasn't capable, because attention was divided below the threshold any single one required to grow. Attention has a threshold property. Below a certain level of concentrated input, things don't develop. They stay in an early stage indefinitely, requiring maintenance without producing growth, consuming time without compounding. This is true of most things that build over time, but it's especially true of income structures in their early stages. The early stage of any income stream is the most fragile, the most dependent on consistent input, the most likely to stall when the input drops below what it needs. Because nothing is self-sustaining yet. No momentum has built. No systems are in place to carry the thing forward without continued active effort. It needs concentrated attention to get through the early stage and into something that begins to hold. Dividing attention across multiple early-stage streams multiplies the fragility. Each one is competing for a share of a limited resource, and the share each receives is rarely enough to move any of them past the point where they become self-sustaining. They stay early stage, indefinitely, each one requiring input to avoid collapsing, none of them receiving enough to actually develop. This is why parallel building almost always produces a collection of unfinished positions rather than a diversified income structure. The number of streams started is not the metric that matters. The number of streams that actually developed past the early stage and into something that holds. That's the metric. And parallel building consistently underperforms on that metric. There's a second cost to parallel building that's less visible. The primary income suffers. The primary income is the foundation. It's what funds the surplus that gets deployed into secondary streams. It's what covers the life while the secondary streams develop. When attention is divided across multiple early-stage secondary streams, some of that attention comes from the primary source. Not always deliberately, but inevitably. The job gets less than full presence. Performance dips slightly. Opportunities inside the primary source get missed or deprioritized. And the primary income, the foundation that everything else is built on, becomes slightly less stable in pursuit of secondary streams that aren't developing anyway. This is the core failure of parallel building. It doesn't just fail to build the secondary streams. It risks destabilizing the primary source in the process. Trading a stable foundation for a collection of unstable early-stage positions that collectively produce less than the primary source alone. That's not diversification. That's fragmentation. And fragmentation compounds differently than diversification does. It spreads vulnerability instead of reducing it, divides productive capacity instead of multiplying it, produces the appearance of building without the structural reality of it. If parallel building fails, the alternative is sequencing, one stream at a time, each one developed to a point of stability before the next one is started. It sounds slower. It feels slower. In the short term, it is slower. But sequencing produces a different outcome over a long enough horizon, and the outcome is what matters, not the pace at which it starts. What does sequencing actually look like? It starts with a single question about the primary income. Is it stable enough to fund the development of something else without being compromised? If yes, the first secondary stream can begin, not multiple. One. The one that requires the least disruption to the primary source. The one that can be built within the existing discretionary time without compressing recovery, performance, or presence in the primary role. That stream receives concentrated attention, not divided attention, concentrated, until it develops past the early stage, until it begins to produce something consistent, until it reaches a point where it holds without requiring the same intensity of input it needed at the start. That point, when the first stream holds, is when the second stream becomes possible, not before. Because before that point, Starting a second stream divides attention below the threshold the first one still needs to develop, and the first one stalls, and the second one never develops. And the result is the same as parallel building, without the clarity of having chosen it. But once the first stream holds, once it produces without requiring constant active input, it frees up attention. And that freed attention can be directed at the second stream, which develops the same way, receives concentrated input, gets through the early stage, reaches the point where it holds. And then the third becomes possible. This is how diversification actually compounds, not through adding many streams quickly, through adding one stream at a time, each one stabilized, each one freeing up capacity for the next. The total number of streams grows more slowly than parallel building attempts, but each stream is real. Each one produces. Each one is past the fragile early stage before the next one is started. And the combined output of 3 stable streams built sequentially almost always exceeds the combined output of 6 unstable streams built in parallel. Because stable compounds. Unstable doesn't. Sequencing also protects something parallel building constantly threatens: the primary source. Because sequencing is explicit about priority. The primary income comes first, always. It is not compromised in pursuit of secondary streams. It is not deprioritized. It is not allowed to suffer so that something else can be started faster. Because the primary income is what makes everything else possible. It funds the surplus. It covers the life. It provides the stability from which secondary streams can be built without existential pressure. Remove that stability, and the secondary streams aren't building toward freedom. They're building under crisis. And crisis produces different decisions than stability does. Sequencing keeps the foundation intact, and an intact foundation is what makes the compounding possible. Pause for a second. If you're still listening, it's probably because this didn't feel exaggerated. That's intentional. If this way of thinking matters to you, like the video, subscribe. We'll keep going deeper. The primary income is not the enemy of secondary income development. It's the engine of it. This distinction matters because the narrative around building income streams often frames the primary income as the thing being escaped, the structure being replaced, the system being left behind. And that framing produces a mistake. It positions the primary income as something to be minimized, given less attention, less energy, less presence, in favor of whatever is being built alongside it, which destabilizes the foundation that makes the building possible. The primary income does several things that secondary streams in early development cannot. It covers the cost of life, housing, food, transportation, the baseline obligations that exist regardless of what's being built on the side. While those obligations are covered, the secondary stream can develop slowly, can survive early-stage losses, can produce inconsistently without creating a crisis. The moment the primary income becomes unable to cover those obligations, the dynamic changes entirely. Now the secondary stream isn't being built toward a position, it's being pressured to produce what the primary source can no longer provide. And that pressure changes what decisions get made, changes what risks feel acceptable, changes the timeline from long-term compounding to short-term survival. The primary income also generates the surplus. The capital deployed into secondary positions comes from somewhere. For most people in the early stages, it comes from what the primary income produces beyond what the life costs. protect that surplus. And the secondary positions have something to build from. Compress that surplus by allowing lifestyle to expand or by destabilizing the primary income, and the secondary positions have nothing to deploy. The foundation funds the diversification, not the other way around, which means protecting the foundation is not a conservative position. It's the prerequisite for everything that comes after it. This is the part most people get wrong about the relationship between primary and secondary income. They see the primary income as a ceiling, something that limits how far they can go, something that needs to be escaped as quickly as possible. And so they underinvest in it, give it less than full presence, let performance drift while attention goes elsewhere. When in reality, a strong primary income gives more to deploy, more surplus, more stability, more time to build secondary streams without existential pressure. A high-performing primary income accelerates the development of secondary streams, not because it gets replaced faster, but because it funds them more effectively. The goal isn't to escape the primary income quickly. The goal is to build alongside it carefully until the secondary streams collectively produce enough to make the primary optional. Not replaced under pressure, made optional through compounding. That's a different timeline, a slower one, but a structurally sound one. And structurally sound positions built on a protected foundation compound towards something real. Structurally compromised positions built on a destabilized foundation produce urgency, not independence. The sustainable model for stacking income streams doesn't look like hustle culture. It doesn't look like burning through every available hour in pursuit of multiple positions simultaneously. It looks slow. It looks sequential. It looks, from the outside, like someone not doing very much compared to what they intend to build. And that appearance is deceptive, because what looks slow in year 1 produces something structurally different by year 5, and by year 10, the compounding makes the early pace look completely irrelevant. The sustainable model has a clear structure. The primary income is protected, performance is maintained, surplus is generated consistently. A portion of discretionary time, small, consistent, protected, goes toward the first secondary stream. That stream receives concentrated attention until it develops past the early stage. When it holds, the second stream begins. Same pattern, concentrated attention, early stage developed through, stability reached before moving on. And the process repeats, not at the pace urgency demands, at the pace that allows each position to actually develop. What does this produce over time? Year 1, one secondary stream developing, small, producing little, but the compounding clock has started. Year 2 or 3, that stream stabilizes, producing something consistent. The second stream begins. Year 4 or 5, 2 stable streams, combined producing meaningfully. Third stream begins. Year 7 or 8, 3 stable streams, each compounding, each producing without full active presence. The primary income becoming progressively less critical to the overall financial position. Year 10, the foundation has shifted. Not because of urgency, not because of sacrifice, because of sequence, because of consistency, because of a structure that protected each position long enough for it to compound. Most people overestimate what can be built in 1 year and underestimate what can be built in 10. The sustainable stacking model is built for the 10-year horizon, not the 1-year sprint. And the difference between those two timelines isn't ambition, it's structure. The sprint produces urgency, fragmentation, and positions that never develop past the early stage. The 10-year model produces a compounding architecture, each stream stable, each one funding or freeing capacity for the next, each one contributing to a position that becomes less dependent on the primary source over time. The sustainable model isn't comfortable. It requires patience in a culture that rewards urgency. It requires consistency when early results don't justify the effort. It requires protecting the primary source when everything else is telling you to move faster. But the model works, not because it's fast, because it's structured correctly. And structure, held consistently over time, compounds into something that urgency and fragmentation never reach. If this shifted something for you, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something.